Thank you very much, Indu. I have a very highly disciplined panel, so I thank my three panelists for abiding by the time. Now, I give the floor to Jack Reddish, who's director of the project OSD of the High Level Risk Management Forum. Buenos días y muchas gracias por esta muy generosa invitación para dirigirme a ustedes. Agradezco al gobierno del Ecuador por esta gentil invitación. Mi nombre es Jack Radic y vengo de OECD, la Organización para Cooperación Económica y Desarrollo, que es una organización intergubernamental con sede en París. Nuestros 34 países miembros son economías industrializadas, pero sí tenemos algunos países miembros en esta región. Nuestro secretario general es de México y la gestión de desastres se ha convertido en un tema muy importante para nuestra organización, especialmente debido a los daños económicos que ocurren. Ahora, yo entiendo que soy el último expositor que está entre ustedes y su almuerzo, así que les prometo que voy a procurar ser breve. Pero bueno, en mi primera diapositiva simplemente quiero advertirles que esta primera diapositiva va a ser la más emocionante que han visto toda la mañana. Ahora, no salgan corriendo a sus oficinas para enviarme emails pidiendo estas diapositivas. Lo pueden hacer cuando terminemos. Pero bueno, la idea aquí es que esto es una correlación entre el PIB per cápita y los índices de mortalidad. Y a mano derecha tienen un grupo de los países OECD, economías industrializadas, con mayor PIB per cápita. Y luego...
So this is to underscore what was said by the previous presentations regarding links between wealth and disaster mortalities. Here again, a very exciting slide to draw your attention, just to say that even inequality persists across OECD countries. If you break up the 34 member countries according to income quartiles, on the lower end, you have a very high mortality rate relative to the higher end of quartile GDP income. But on the downside, so to speak, for those wealthier countries, you can see the economic damages are much higher. Now, we've had 10 years of helical framework for action, and a lot of good policy recommendations have been made in that framework. And yet, it's estimated that nearly 1.5 trillion US dollars of economic damages have occurred in the last 10 years in OECD countries and BRIC countries alone. It's an enormous amount of money. If we look at a few of our member countries, such as Chile and New Zealand, some of the fantastically awful events that have occurred have led to economic losses in excess of 10% of GDP, and in one case 20%. But that national level damage is not really what you have to focus on. You have to think about what that means for the localities that were utterly devastated, and what that means for local policymakers to reconstruct, if it's possible. Before addressing some of the questions about inequalities and vulnerable populations, I just want to set some context further on some of the longer-term trends. Here we're looking at a number of annual disasters in OECD countries and BRIC countries dating from 1980, where they were below 100, hovering around 60, 70, and then peaking in the early 2000s, upwards of 350. So we're seeing a vast increase in the number of disasters. And that same trend holds true for economic losses across OECD countries and BRIC countries over the same time period. Relatively low in 1980, and then over 300 billion in losses in 2011. Now, moving away from some of the economic analysis and more into the risk drivers, of course, we've heard quite a bit about urbanization and concentration of assets. Here we have lines describing the world urban population and rural population. beginning in 1960 and forecast at 2035, and also for the OECD, urban population and rural populations. You can see the vast increases in urbanization. I want to now turn to more of the social phenomena, and in particular one which drives vulnerability in OECD countries, and that is aging populations. And if you look at 3 of the main disasters in OECD countries over the last 15 years, going back, Hurricane Sandy, half of the total fatalities were people above the age of 65 years old. Hurricane Katrina, 71% of the fatalities were people over 60 years old. And the European heat wave of 2003, most of the fatalities were elderly people who lived alone. And here, I just want to come back to what Alfonso was saying about looking beyond the economics of disasters and understanding them in terms of the social dynamics. Because if you want to create public policies that can mitigate or reduce disaster risk, you really have to take off your economist's hat and put on your sociologist's hat. To understand the catastrophe of 15,000 people dying in France, my country, which is one of the largest economies in the world, from a heat wave. You have to understand that these elderly people live alone, and that basically their children went off to the beach for vacation and forgot about them. It's a very harsh judgment, but it's the harsh truth. And if we think about, this is another graph that shows the proportion of elderly populations in OECD countries. And you can see some of the countries on the left-hand side with the highest proportions are countries that are very heavily exposed to natural hazards. Japan, Italy, Germany, Greece, Portugal. And on the right-hand side, you have Mexico, Turkey, Korea. Far lower percentages of their population are above 65. But the shaded bars are the forecasts to 2050. And you can see the enormous changes, especially in Korea, which will then exceed 37%, but also Mexico, over 20% by 2050. So the reason I bring this to your attention today is to think in the longer term about some of the mistakes that the OECD countries have made, so you can prepare in the future when the youth bulge becomes an elderly bulge. In the interest of time, I'm going to go past. This is just a zoom on a few of the countries on the 12-year trend, and move into a more prescriptive part of the presentation. Because after all, why we're here, in great part, is not only to share knowledge and learn from each other, but to prepare for Sunday, Japan next year. The OECD earlier this month agreed to a council recommendation, that is our governing body. Our 34 member countries agreed to a recommendation on the governance of critical risks. These large-scale events, how to prepare for them, how to prevent them, how to efficiently recover and reconstruct. We've been working very closely with the UNISDR to share our knowledge in this area. And it's very important for us that this council recommendation is mutually reinforcing with whatever follows from the HFA, if it's called HFA 2 or post-2015, I don't think there's an official title yet. But in any case, that this OECD work can reinforce in both directions the UN work. It's not enough for us to paint this broad social trends. That's not going to be actionable for policymakers to know what the proportions are of elderly populations. Our governments need to support research that I've seen going on in countries sitting in this room that take hazard maps and overlay those maps with census data. That will start to give the policymakers the granularity of information to begin to target populations with targeted measures, to inform the elderly and their families about exposure to hazards and the countermeasures to take, to use voluntary organizations to monitor their well-being when hazardous events occur, to provide subsidized housing for elderly communities, and to build specific capabilities into local emergency plans geared toward needs of elderly. I understand that we're just about out of time, and so I thank you very much for your attention. And again, if you'd like the spreadsheets behind those fantastic slides, please don't hesitate to contact me.